Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Brian Curtis along with Doug Krisner. Join us each day for the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcasts and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.
We welcome our guest, David Chao. He is a global market strategist for the Asia Pacific at Invesco, joining us from Hong Kong. David, it's always a pleasure. So what do you think is the bigger driver these days? It's this euphoria over AI or the euphoria that we're going to get rate cuts in the U.S.?
Well, I think that it depends on where you're sitting. Certainly, the euphoria over cuts to the Fed policy has more of a global phenomenon, especially to emerging markets. Now, the euphoria over AI, that certainly benefits more kind of Northeast Asian economies and stock markets.
In terms of the Fed, we heard last week on Friday from Chair Jay Powell at the Jackson Hole Symposium. So it's a foregone conclusion, I think, that we're going to get a rate cut at the September meeting. Right now, the swaps market is pricing in maybe as much as 100 basis points of easing, 1 full percentage point worth of cuts between now and the end of the year. Do you think that's a little too aggressive on the part of the swaps market?
Yes, I think that's a bit too much because the economic data points that we're looking at continue to be a bit mixed. The most recent consumer confidence and sentiment data points show surprisingly strength, but yet the labor data is more mixed. So I think that, and then we're watching the inflation data set to come out shortly. So I think that given all these indicators, it suggests that we'll get cuts, but perhaps 25 basis points and 2 of them before the end of the year, less than the 100 basis points that the markets may be pricing in.
So as you know, before Powell spoke, we heard from the BOJ Governor Kazuo Ueda, and he was saying last Friday that the BOJ will likely continue raising interest rates. Do you think we're going to get a higher rate adjustment from the BOJ before the end of the year?
I think we'll have perhaps one more rate hike of around 10 basis points from the BOJ, sooner rather than later. And that certainly would have an impact on strengthening the Japanese yen. But the BOJ was very clear after the recent volatility that they're going to be slow and they're going to be also data reliant. We continue to watch for domestic consumption to improve in Japan. I think that certainly is the missing piece for Japanese equities to trend higher over the next 6 months.
How are the exporters, in your view, in Japan faring these days, particularly when you consider that the number one trading partner for Japan is China, and we know that things on the mainland are still pretty sluggish?
Well, let me just say there is a big misperception that if the Japanese yen strengthens, that's bad for Japanese equities because the exporters would lose out. But if you look at which companies have done well so far this year because of the Japanese economy or the yen, it's really the financial stocks and Japanese banks and brokers, insurers. They're the ones that have been benefiting. So I think there's a misperception there. That if the Japanese yen strengthens, then the equity market should face headwinds. Now, when it comes to Japanese exporters, let me just say that it's been a long time since Japan has been investing in their supply chains, over decades. And so just because one market might be, face some pressures or some disentanglement, that doesn't mean to say that there aren't additional markets. Japanese exporters have been investing significantly in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore. And I think that, these are other markets that they can sell to and also produce in.
Well, let's talk a little bit about China. I mean, I'm wondering whether or not you're encouraged by the small measures undertaken by the government to try to turn things around. I mean, it doesn't seem to be working. I mean, do we need to give it a lot more time?
Well, I think we need to see more significant stimulus measures. So far, there have been kind of bits and pieces here and there, small cuts to the policy rate, a bit of easing on the property market. I don't think that we're going to get the big bazooka stimulus, such as what we got, in 2008, 2009. But I think that what we need is more signals from the government that they are very focused on ensuring that growth is back on track for that 5% growth target, and also to ensure that the property market, finds a floor.
But the deflation story, I don't think, can be argued, right? I mean, China seems to be mired in that. And some people had said a while back that if the government didn't take more aggressive steps, maybe there was a slight chance that China could become what Japan was 30 years ago.
Well, I think the big question is how much longer will the property market languish? And if you look at all the property crisis over the past 30 years, I mean, there are over like 20 examples to look at. The average kind of boom to bust time is around 7 years. And so China, the property market has been in the doldrums around 3 years. So there could be a bit longer period that we may be facing these headwinds. But in the meantime, the economy continues to chug along, especially on exports. They did a big bet. President Xi made a big bet in terms of trying to further industrialize the economy, to really focus on manufacturing capex spending, and that has been a very strong juggernaut for the economy.
No doubt about that, but I'm wondering that there may be at the same time a bit of an overcapacity problem, and I'm cautious in using that term, but nonetheless, I mean, it's one of the reasons that the U.S. and members of the European Union are upset with the degree of pressure that China is applying on exports.
That's right. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. If only kind of 1 out of 3 propellers of your economy is working, you certainly want to kind of juice that propeller. But certainly, I don't think that the policymakers could have foreseen some of the blowback from the U.S. or Europe. But let me say that, while the U.S. and Europe, are not a fan of Chinese EVs, other places are, like in Brazil and, African economies. They may not replace that of the U.S. or European economies, but certainly they're, global trade is a funny thing. It's like a balloon. You squeeze it in one place, it kind of just goes to another. So I don't think that it's a big problem. We'll
leave it there. David, always a pleasure. Thanks so much. David Chao from Invesco joining us here on Daybreak Asia. David is a global market strategist for the Asia Pacific. President Biden's top national security aide, Jake Sullivan, was in Beijing meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Let's take a closer look now with our own Jenni Marsh, Bloomberg team leader for Greater China Eco-Gov. Jenni, the timing is curious. I think we can agree there's going to be a new U.S. administration in January. Is it possible that President Biden may go to China or at least meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping? Are we seeing the groundwork for that potentially being laid?
I mean, that's what you would normally expect from a trip like this. You would expect a senior White House official like Jake Sullivan to be laying the groundwork for a Biden visit to China. And, if he does leave office in January without visiting China, he will be the first U.S. president to do so since Jimmy Carter. So that's 4 decades of precedent that he'll be breaking. But I think the answer probably is no. Just looking at the calendar now in the U.S. going forward with the election, I don't think it makes sense for Biden to make a trip to China. But that being said, both Biden and Xi are heading to the G20, or are expected to, certainly, in Brazil in November. So that will be their sort of final chance to come together as world leaders and sort of have a parting conversation. But I think in terms of a Biden trip to China, I think, COVID really held him back from that. And now I think the window's closed. Describe for me where we stand in relations between Beijing and Washington right now. Has there been a bit of a thaw? I think thaw might be just slightly too optimistic. I think they, I think they found a way to find a firm footing. So things aren't going to spiral like they did after the spy balloons sort of drifted across the US and all bets were off and the meetings were cancelled. They found a way to keep talking, to keep dialogue open, and they kind of believe that will stabilize the relationship. But in terms of, what they see eye to eye on and how the actual sort of the health of the relationship, Canada announced all these tariffs, EV tariffs on China, just as Sullivan was arriving in China, mirroring US industrial policy. And, the US is corralling its allies to sort of stand behind it and sort of fighting against what it calls a flood of cheap Chinese exports. It's backing up its sort of military partners in the region around China, where China's having these sort of territorial disputes. I think from China's point of view, the US is sort of really becoming more powerful at joining forces with other major nations in prosecuting its policy against China. And so I think for China, it's like very hard to balance this idea of competition and also at the same time being partners. And that's what the US wants. But, there's so much friction building in the relationship around trade that, it's hard to see how these two countries sort of can work together in many areas going forward.
Yeah, and if the Biden administration is known for one thing, I think you must include, as it relates to China in particular, the export controls on some of the advanced semiconductor technology, and that to some extent has held China's technical aspirations back just a little bit. Do you think that there is going on right now in Beijing, a sense of what Kamala Harris, I think Xi Jinping has dealt with Donald Trump in the past. Yes, there is a bit of a mercurial nature there and an unpredictability, I guess, that can be said fairly. But in terms of a potential Harris administration, how do you think Beijing is viewing her candidacy?
I think, broadly speaking, she sees continuity from Biden. She's been his vice president. She hasn't said anything to suggest that she would deviate from his foreign policy. She's expected to remain tough on China because, if nothing else, that is a bipartisan issue. But I think also she's a little bit unknown. She's a bit untested on foreign policy. There's very little meat on the bones in terms of her comments, about how she personally feels about China. So there's probably a feeling in Beijing right now, of just like waiting to see, these interviews that are coming up that she's going to do. There's one with CNN, the potential debate with Trump. Maybe she'll make some more comments then. Her DNC speech, she touched on Ukraine, Russia, and Israel, but she didn't sort of elaborate on China at all. So I think it's still like wait and see if she sort of does say anything that sort of differentiates her from Biden. But I think right now she's seen as a continuity candidate. But, for Biden, this stuff, foreign policy was like front and center for him. It was really one of the things he was sort of most passionate about on his agenda, and China in particular, particularly given his relationship with Xi. So I guess there is a chance, because she isn't someone who comes from a strong foreign policy background, that she takes the foot off the gas a little bit. But, I think we're really still waiting for her to kind of come out and lay out her foreign policy agenda.
You mentioned the G20 meeting in November. What is China hoping to accomplish here? Is there a goal or a couple of aims on the part of President Xi?
I think it's going to be specifically if Xi meets Biden at the G20, it's going to be, I think, just, a passing goodbye in a way, really, because I have to check the dates, but I think it will come after the election. So he will know by then if it will be Harris or if it will be Trump. Who is coming into the White House in January. If it's Harris, then he has a channel, Democrat, to perhaps pass on a message to Kamala and to the new administration. If it's Trump, this meeting with Biden, they can talk, they can sort of swap notes, but really she will be going back into sort of, I guess, uncharted territory, because he has been there before, but with Trump, nothing's ever the same. It's, he wakes up and decides things depending on how he's feeling in the morning. So, I think their aim is just to keep talking and to sort of keep things from escalating. I think the last thing Beijing wants is for things to get any more sort of difficult as it faces all of these complaints on multiple fronts from so many countries on its trade and its military sort of ambitions.
No doubt. And in addition to the European Union, Canada announcing new tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. Jenni, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for making time to chat with us. Jenni Marsh, Bloomberg team leader for Greater China Eco-Gov, joining us here on Daybreak Asia. We welcome our guest, Freda Zietlow, Managing Director and Senior Portfolio Manager at Fiduciary Trust International. Freda joins us from San Mateo, California. Nice of you to stop by. Can we talk about this AI trade? Because the market seems to be on pins and needles, not only where the numbers from Nvidia are concerned, but I think to some extent Salesforce as well tomorrow after the bell.
Yes, of course. Hello, Doug. Nice to be here. I think right now all eyes are on Nvidia. After the close tomorrow, Nvidia will release its earnings. And I think right now it's not a question, as we all know, about demand. It's really on the supply side for Nvidia. I think the market's going to watch whether or not there might be any supply chain issues and what's happening with, say, the Blackwell chip delivery. And I think the demand right now, it's probably larger than Nvidia can supply. And, you have all the big tech names really investing a lot of capital, wanting to be first not to be left behind and really want to take advantage of this AI revolution. And Nvidia, it's really the main supplier, really the only supplier who could provide high-end chips to all the players in the industry. That said, the stock have been up 20% since the August 5th low, and we will have to see. I think the market's going to be reading the tea leaves.
So if there's a little bit of a disappointment here, I think that would spell potential problem for the overall equity market, since so much of what we have seen in terms of performance, particularly in the NASDAQ stocks, the NASDAQ 100, I think, can credit about 30% of its move to Nvidia alone. I mean, so if there's a little bit of cloudiness on the horizon when Nvidia offers its guidance tomorrow, that could spell difficulty for the overall market, right?
Absolutely. 30% of NASDAQ, 6% of S&P, certainly a large component of the market.
Where are you when it comes to reading the tea leaves where the Fed is concerned? That was a pretty amazing speech that Chair Jay Powell gave at the Jackson Hole Symposium last Friday. He's laying out the carpet here for the first rate cut. The question, I think, in the market's mind is whether it will be 25 or 50. What is an accommodation now, a shift in stance on the part of the Fed mean for the overall market? Should we be concerned if there's economic slowing about the quality of earnings, or will lower interest rates help inject more liquidity in the market and then it's off to the races?
So I think the market is really anticipating a rate cut in the next Fed meeting. And I think Jerome Powell said as much. The time has come. And I think that really was what the market is looking for. So the question is how much and how fast. And my view is the Fed's going to be measured out of the gate, 25 basis points. It's widely expected. Some are speculating 50. I think to start, that might be a little aggressive. And I think at the end of the day, the Fed's going to be data-driven. We have the August job report coming after Labor Day. That will be something that the Fed will be watching very closely. And if that report come in with, a bigger disappointment than anticipated, then the chance of a larger rate cut would be possible. So we'll have to see.
So one of the things I think the Fed is concerned about now is the weakness that we have seen in the labor market, more so than the inflation story. Yep. Should we be concerned about the U.S. consumer? I noted earlier the fact that consumer confidence moved up in the month of August. Are you concerned at all about the health of the consumer?
So I think the consumer has been very resilient. We saw the consumer number coming out at 6 months high. And we also saw, some of the consumer stable company reporting very strong earnings. And while there's definitely concern about labor slowing down, however, even for the very disappointing July job report, we are still at a very low unemployment rate. So I would say the labor is weaker, but not weak. And that provided support for consumer confidence and continued consumption.
So we're obviously in the election season. Things will really heat up after the Labor Day holiday if they haven't already. How do you see the election factoring into the behavior of the market, both on the equity side and in fixed income as well?
So, Doug, I think it's a little too early to tell. I think both candidates had shared some high points about potential what their policy might look like. I think there's a sense that, we may see more tax cuts and tariffs under Trump, which, could be inflationary. It could also stimulate the economy. And Harris, there's a sense that tax rate will go up for high earners, that's our corporations. That might, hamper equity prices. However, there's other offsetting policies. So right now it's a little early to tell. And one important thing to note is that we will also have to see how both chambers will be controlled or split, and which will sort of influence what policies actually get passed.
Freda, before I let you go, I want to get your sense of what, if any, opportunities you're seeing offshore right now. Is there anything that you find attractive outside the U.S.?
I think a lot of attention, Doug, has been on Japan. And I think Japan is showing, a lot of green shoots in terms of corporate reform and economic growth. The government is trying to normalize currency rate, and in the process introduce some volatility. But longer term, that could be continue to be an interesting place to look.
Freda, we'll leave it there. Nice of you to join us on Daybreak Asia. Freda Lam Zietlow, Managing Director, also Senior Portfolio Manager at Fiduciary Trust International, on the line from San Mateo, California. The U.S. Special Counsel investigating former President Trump is pressing ahead with prosecuting Mr. Trump on charges of trying to overturn the 2020 election. Let's take a closer look now with our own Zoe Tillman, Bloomberg senior legal reporter, who joins us from Washington, D.C. Thanks for making time for us, Zoe. Can you walk me through this? This is essentially a revision that follows a Supreme Court decision on immunity, presidential immunity, right?
That's right. So earlier in the summer, the Supreme Court held that presidents, not just former President Donald Trump, but all presidents, are largely immune from being prosecuted for official acts that they took in office. And the justices said that this meant that certain allegations in the indictment against Trump could no longer stand, related to his efforts to use the Justice Department in his efforts 4 years ago to try and overturn the results of the election. However, the justices said the rest of the indictment was basically up for debate as to whether some of it could go forward or if all or some of it had to fall. So special counsel Jack Smith and his team went back. They went through the indictment. They went to a federal grand jury in Washington, a new grand jury that hadn't heard any of this evidence, and came back today with a similar but different indictment. It's the same charges, conspiring to obstruct the election, but missing a few pages related to the Justice Department's role in that, but largely the same set of charges against him.
So this case is before U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan. Obviously, now there, I would imagine, are going to be a few motions made before her court. Is it likely that this could be revisited in any way by the Supreme Court?
It's possible. I think it's less likely than the first time. The conservative majority took a lot of time to lay out and articulate a standard for immunity. And going forward, the court will be less inclined to take this back up again. However, Trump's lawyers are going to comb through this new superseding indictment, looking for anything that they think still fails under the immunity test that the Supreme Court articulated. And they could go back and say to Judge Chutkan, we still think that he's immune. We still think that there is official conduct here that he's being charged for. And whoever loses could appeal that all the way back up to the Supreme Court. Whether they would take it, unclear, but it's an option ahead of even getting close to a trial.
So if you can compare and contrast the initial indictment that targeted the president with what we have received today, this new indictment.
Right. So the overarching theme is exactly the same. Prosecutors say that the former president, along with some unindicted, unnamed co-conspirators, worked together to try and overturn the election in a few different ways. And the ways that are similar across these indictments are, finding pro-Trump electors to sign false certifications saying he won in swing states, taking advantage, exploiting the chaos on January 6th at the Capitol, trying to enlist Vice President Mike Pence to stop Congress from certifying the results. What's gone now is a section about his dealings with Justice Department officials, and specifically a former high-level official named Jeffrey Clark, who was boosting his unsupported, baseless claims of voter fraud to try and get the Justice Department to put its thumb on the scales in these swing states. That's all gone. The Supreme Court said that's a no-go. And references to Donald Trump's communications with other executive branch officials who were telling him at the time that there was no evidence to support his fraud claims, that's all gone too. But the core themes are all still there. Some interesting, more subtle adjustments to the indictment are noticeable, where they focus on characterizing him less as a president at the time, even though he was, and as a candidate for office, as a citizen. They're trying to, get around the Supreme Court saying that if it had any relation to his duties as president at the time, it's off limits. So they're trying to stress now in this new indictment that we're talking about candidate Donald Trump and citizen Donald Trump, and not President Donald Trump.
It's kind of interesting. We're a little more than 2 months away from the presidential election, and were the former president to be reelected, I think it's fair to say that maybe this case just goes away. If Kamala Harris is elected to the presidency, is it likely that the special counsel will continue to press this case?
That is the expectation. There is no reason to think that she would cut short the work at this point. It's not clear if the special counsel will push Judge Chutkan to move more quickly ahead of the election, or if they'll say it's fine to let these next steps unfold in the normal course. And honestly, like the rest of us, Jack Smith may want to wait and see how this all shakes out.
What are the next things that we should be looking out for? Maybe you can give me a sense of the timeline. I know we just talked about the context of the election here, but in the normal proceeding where the defense counsel would have a chance to respond to the indictment and there'll be hearings before the judge, can you kind of sketch out a timeline for us?
Sure. So we're expecting to hear from both sides later this week with proposals for the schedule that they want. And the judge has asked them to come in next week to talk this through and to set a schedule. We haven't gotten any indication yet that either side is sort of raring to go. And even if there are fewer motions now. I mean, they've already litigated over a previous or similar version of this indictment. So some issues, Judge Chutkan may say, I've already answered on some of these issues. But, if there are motions to dismiss for other reasons, if they want to raise the immunity issue again, we're looking at a timeline of months, not even weeks, I suspect. There's a normal course of business to file briefs, to respond, to hold arguments, to wait for the judge's decision. It seems highly unlikely at this point that anything would really get resolved, and certainly not at the appellate level before the election. The immediate next steps are Donald Trump will need to be arraigned on this new indictment. The prosecutor said he doesn't need to show up, but that will have to happen, and that'll be what we're looking at next.
Zoe, great stuff. Thank you so much for making time to chat with us. Zoe Tillman, Bloomberg senior legal reporter, joining us from Washington, D.C. as a U.S. Special Counsel Jack Smith presses ahead with prosecuting former President Trump. This is Bloomberg.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen. And always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.